creation, you're the Lord of everyone, and your cry of love rings out across the land.
Amen. Please be seated.
Please pray with me. Loving God, we just prayed that you would release in us the gifts of spirit that give you glory, which is something of a dangerous prayer. But I pray that you've released in me the words to say, to give you glory, and in each of us the gift of an open heart to receive your spirit and your word. Amen.
Amen.
So, last week I promised that I would return to the other great leader of early Israel, who is remembered for music amongst many other things, Miriam. Miriam, not quite so well known, well remembered as David. You know, David gets 2 whole books and an awful lot of mentions everywhere else, plus all those psalms. But, you know, patriarchy. But the fact that Miriam's there at all speaks volumes about who she was, how important she was at her time. You know, number one, she's in it. Not many women make their way into the canon of Scripture after it's been thoroughly edited. And other things, we know where she died and where she was buried. It's in Numbers 20. She died and was buried at Kadesh in the desert. Now, we know that of only 2 other people who took part in the Exodus and the wandering in the desert: Moses and Aaron the high priest. So there's another clue. Also, she is Miriam the prophetess. They're very clear about that. The other one that we've got in the early bits of the Bible is Deborah, who judged and ruled Israel for however many years it was in the book of Judges. And some commentators like to downplay that, or, well, it's not the same as a prophet, but me, I think it is. You know, I think that maybe we know about Miriam because she was part of Moses and Aaron's family. But all that means is that they had slightly less excuse to forget her and push her under the carpet than they had for most of the other women who were leading and prophesying in those days. So, Miriam. We first meet her when she's a little girl, in the 2nd chapter of Exodus. She's Moses' big sister. And when Pharaoh has declared that all the baby boys born to Israel are to be killed the moment they're born, Moses' mother hides him by placing him in a watertight basket wrapped safely and put in the reeds by the side of the river Nile. She, you know, the Nile was kind of divine. She gives him to the Nile because she can't protect him, and she's hoping against hope that God will. But obviously Miriam's not so confident. She stays and watches over her baby brother, and when Pharaoh's daughter pulls the basket out of the water and sees the baby and decides to keep the baby, she has the wit and audacity to say, "Shall I go and find you a wet nurse from amongst the Hebrew women?" Because, you know, as in many cultures across time, wealthy upper-class women apparently made of porcelain and don't breastfeed their own babies. And in any case, she wasn't actually the baby's mother. But Miriam, clever little cookie, has the audacity to go and fetch Moses' own mother. So she gets not only to raise her baby instead of watching him be killed, she gets paid for it. I think that's great. I really do. And then you meet Miriam again, and she is Miriam the prophetess, leading the singing and dancing by the Sea of Reeds after they've passed through. And, you know, Moses might have had to be raised in Pharaoh's household, commit murder, run off, keep sheep in the desert and see a burning bush. But apparently Miriam's managed to become a prophet all by herself in Egypt as a slave. And so she's clearly a leader in this scene. She's a prophet. And then we do hear about her later. She's quite unfairly punished, I think, because I do think Aaron was equally guilty, if anyone was guilty of what happened. But anyway, because Aaron and Miriam decide Moses has got a bit above himself. And they go to see him and they say, and this is the important bit, are we not also prophets? Has not God spoken through us? Now, whether they were right or whether they were wrong about Moses, I mean, God says, yes, prophets, wonderful, but Moses is special, and you're just going to have to get used to that. But nonetheless, it's very clear that Miriam is being placed on an equal with Aaron here. Miriam is a leader of Israel and someone who has the Spirit of God. It's in Numbers 12. Go look it up. But what it seems to me is that it's one of these things, when religion gets itself organised, when it starts to have buildings and books and hierarchies and structures and things, it moves away from prophecy. It moves away from the Spirit. This is a human thing. It's a thing we do. We prefer safety and structure. We don't like not knowing what's coming next. But when this happens, suddenly the women and the people, the foreigners who are not part of the people of Israel or whatever it is, the poor, the ones without a classical or formal education, the slightly crazy, and I say that in a good way, are also shunted out of the picture and cease to have a voice. Because whilst the Spirit chooses all these people, we tend not to, as human beings, as the human race. And in the early days of the church, after the sort of canon of scripture as we know it had been written and was more or less agreed upon, there was this big movement to separate themselves from all these groups they decided were heretical. And there were lots of them that came up over the whole history of the church, 2,000 odd years. One of them was called Montanism. Followers of Montanism. That's not what they called themselves. They called themselves the Church of the New Prophecy, because they believed in prophecy. It had sort of drained away, died out amongst the sort of organised, what became the mainstream, the people who write the history because they won. They were more about apostolic succession and the laying on of hands by bishops being how the Spirit worked. But Montanus and his followers, they believed that God was still speaking, that the Spirit was still inspiring people, that there were new truths to be told, that people could still be prophets. What's interesting is none of what they said was actually heretical. It was actually pretty much the same thing everyone else was saying, but they were counted as heretics because of this prophecy thing. They were very unreliable. They were too Spirit-driven. And also, they kept being led by women. And these prophets were loudly spoken women who prophesied and were very strong-minded, strong-willed leaders. And obviously, you know, the Bishop of Rome and so forth didn't like that very much. It was scary. And in fact, a very modern commentator writing about the way in which the church dealt with Montanism said that wasn't it good that Montanism had been treated as a heresy and died out, because otherwise the church would have developed not under the guidance of rational and educated people whom he meant well-off men, but wild and excitable women. But the Spirit is wild and excitable. And actually, if you're going to use the Hebrew name Ruach, which is feminine, for the Spirit, you might as well say that the Spirit is a wild, excitable woman. You know, not literally, obviously, because gender and God, not something I like to try and bring together too much. God being way, way bigger than all that rubbish. But the Spirit is wild and excitable and all those things that culture has considered not very masculine and not very safe. The Spirit is uncomfortable. The Spirit makes us uncomfortable. The Spirit is counter to our structures and our orderliness. Like David and his dancing. When they brought the ark up to Jerusalem, David risks and gets the complete scorn of his wife for dancing around naked in a loincloth, as it's just not very dignified. And actually even Saul has his moment when the sign that Samuel had correctly said to him that he was going to be king one day was that when he met these prophets, the Spirit would come on him and he'd dance around madly in a frenzied prophesying, and he did. Just the once. But the thing is that that's all right for Saul and for David, but when the not normative speak up, you know, the women, the LGBT folk, the foreigner and the refugee, the poor person without a formal education, the people we think of as being a bit mad. Especially if they've got a real, true Spirit message. They're often accused of wildness, of instability, of unreliability. They're only respected if they're proved true in retrospect, and sometimes not even then. But you know, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was accused of that. Troy Perry was accused of that. Jesus was accused of that. And, you know, history's proved them right. The belief that the gospel, the good news, the belief that God's church, truth and hope and peace and all those things require the removal of emotionalness, of variety and changeability, of upheaval and inspiration. It just doesn't hold true. That's not how the good news works. Now me, I am no prophet. I don't see visions. I'm not particularly excitable. I'm not afraid of such things anymore. I was uneasy. But I've learned through my life that actually you have to be willing for upheaval to happen, and you have to be okay with the things that you might see as thoroughly crazy and unstable. I know it because I've been there and I've seen what I thought of as the meltdowns and the crazy fits and all these things, and I learned that they weren't. I learned that they were people with truth. Okay, their truth at that point in time was angry or frightened, but it wasn't less true. And I've also learned from seeing the fear in other people's eyes. I am disruptive without doing anything. I am disruptive by existing, and I have seen the fear in people's eyes when I disrupt the status quo by existing. So I know how scary I am. I try and be as nice and gentle as possible, but sometimes I'm just scary by standing there. And we are all sometimes just scary by being LGBTQI, by being someone who'll speak up about climate change or animal cruelty or homelessness, by being someone who does things differently. We're disruptive. And that's a good thing, because there are some things that need disrupting. So I've been at 2 conferences this week. One as a delegate to a conference about trans stuff in churches, and one as a PA to a delegate about disability studies. To be honest, I learned more from the disability studies. I taught quite a lot in trans awareness stuff, but I learnt a hell of a lot from disability studies. And what I saw was the way that the scholars there, mostly people with disabilities themselves, of one kind or another, have turned the tide on the idea that it's all about helping people be more normal. What one speaker described as striving valiantly to be like everyone else, and actually put their foot down or their wheel down and said, no, I'm not going to strive valiantly to be a little less good at X, whatever X is, when I could strive brilliantly to be uniquely better than you at something else, which is just for me. And I thought, yes, that's it. That's what I needed to learn. Which meant that learning what we all hate to learn, which is that orderliness and containment, and that doesn't matter whether it's containment of the body or the emotions or the way that your brain works, which is neurotypical, aren't actually the highest good we can attain to. That actually striving not to be messy or different or difficult is not the greatest thing we could try to achieve. And God proves that, because what could be more messy than mixing those beautifully neat characters of God and human being and getting Jesus? Stagnation is not a spiritual gift, even if you did try and disguise it as stability. Real stability isn't something we can create, and it's not something we can impose. We don't build the rock, we build on the rock. And I can be sometimes wonderfully, messily unstable. But deep down, I will always know that I am built on the rock. That my stability is not something I create. It's something I was given. It's God. And on that I build. And sometimes I knock down what I build and I build something else. But the rock is there. And it wasn't ever me. The beautiful chaos of God is a pattern so big and so interconnected and so diverse that we will never be able to grasp it as individuals. But I think it's very likely that wild, excitable prophets with open hearts are going to grasp an awful lot more of it than when we try to organise bits of it into tiny boxes that we can grasp. Is it frightening? Oh yes. It's terrifying, and I am often still terrified. Because there's a lot of Jesus' teachings which frighten me. The bits where I have to give up my personal safety nets and privileges for the sake of other people. The bits where I have to die to live. Oh well, still in there, scary or not. We say, better the devil you know. Gospel doesn't say so. You know, the Israelites would have stayed in Egypt. The church would have stayed in Jerusalem. They didn't because they listened to the Spirit. To strange people like Peter and Paul and so on. So thank God for wild, excitable women and others and all those who know that the Spirit will not be contained. If we forget it, we're just another organisation. As long as we remember it, we will be MCC as it was called to be. We will be good news. Amen.
Amen.